Hello, and welcome to Sound Strategic. I'm Meia Nouwens, Senior Fellow for Chinese Security and Defense Policy and host of the IISS Sound Strategic podcast. Joining me today to reflect on the 22nd IISS Shangri-La Dialogue are three IISS experts: Veerle Nouwens, Executive Director of the IISS Asia, who plays a leading role in the organization of the dialogue; Michaels, Research Fellow for Southeast Asian Security and Defense; and Darshana Baruah, Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Indo-Pacific Defense and Strategy. Veerle, Morgan, and Darshana, welcome to the show.
Veerle, for those in our audience who haven't participated in the Shangri-La Dialogue before, can you give a sense of who was represented and the scope of this year's dialogue? It's sometimes hard to talk about the scale.
Absolutely. At the dialogue this year, we had 57 nationalities represented, 54 government delegations, as well as 7 international organizations present. We had 3 heads of state, we had 28 full ministers, countless other deputy and assistant ministers as well, and then 28 chiefs of defense. Quite a large gathering over the weekend.
As always, U.S.-China relations are a key topic of discussion and interest. This year, the U.S. was represented by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who presented on the U.S.'s new ambitions for Indo-Pacific security. What did you think were the standout points from his speech?
As our Director General and Chief Executive noted, this was a major and comprehensive statement of U.S. policy for the region. For those who wanted reassurance that the U.S. wasn't going anywhere, this will have been a very welcome speech. Secretary Hegseth underscored very clearly that the Indo-Pacific remains the U.S.'s priority theater. As he noted, he is going to keep coming back and back and back again. He did also make a point to say that, the United States was there, head of defense level. Unfortunately, one other country was not, making a point to underscore that China was not represented at a high level this year at the dialogue. What is also very clear is that in Secretary Hegseth's speech, it was noted that this was a turning point in U.S. policy to the region. He said America is proud to be back in the Indo-Pacific and we're here to stay. Now, he set out 3 things, really. He set out very clearly the threat, the U.S.'s vision, and then really the way forward. He summarized that quite succinctly, I think, at the end of his speech when he noted that U.S. policy was going to be a couple of things: peace through strength, reestablishing deterrence, sharing burdens, multiplying shared strengths, and reinforcing alliances. He also added that it embodied the principles of not starting wars, but preventing them, and really building a better future together with countries in the region. There was also an interesting point around the message to Europe there, which I think was framed positively, but with clarity around what the United States thinks of Europe's role in the region. One, he held up European partners as really a role model for those in the Indo-Pacific, given Europe's own increasing defense spending. So really going back to that point of investing in your own defense, but working together to ensure that. And then secondly, he noted that he felt that Europe's comparative advantage really lies in the defense of Europe and of the European continent, and that the comparative advantage of the United States lies in the Indo-Pacific and working there in defense and military terms. And so, again, that goes back to that burden sharing point as well, with both the need for investment in one's own capabilities as well as better coordination and taking care of one's own region, so to speak. I think what he also really stressed was a sense of urgency that I don't think we've quite heard in the same way before. He noted that, the time is now, the threats will not wait, nor can we. He also made it very clear that he just wasn't going to sugarcoat this challenge. That challenge is China. He noted in no uncertain terms that China, in the view of the United States, seeks to become a hegemonic power in Asia. And at the end of the day, this is a concern of the United States, a real one. He also made it very clear that President Trump would not allow any invasion by China of Taiwan on his watch, which I think was also a very strong point to make in terms of U.S. policy in the region. equally discussing the element of strength in the peace through strength mantra, he also made a nod towards the peace element of that. He noted that the United States does not seek war with China. It doesn't seek to humiliate China or even seek regime change in China. It was interesting to note that when there was a question from a Chinese individual in the audience, he said that he welcomed that dialogue and he welcomed that conversation. What he said at the end of the day was that the United States seeks to ensure that China does not dominate its allies or its partners. This is a common sense goal that everyone should be able to live with. On the way forward, I think there was very substantive in examples that were provided by Secretary Hegseth. He really noted several initiatives. There were 3 ways in particular that he sought to outline in ways in which that the United States would reestablish deterrence in the region. That included, firstly, prioritizing forward postured combat credible forces in the Western Pacific to deter by denial. Secondly, to support allies and partners to strengthen their own defense capabilities and capacity. And he named a few examples there, from the Maritime Security Consortium to military exercises in the region. And then finally, to revitalize the defense industrial bases and relocating resources. And there he specifically noted the Partnership for Indo-Pacific Defense Resilience, or PIPER, as well as specific first projects under that framework, which I'm sure will have been welcomed to know. But at the end of the day, I think the overarching message was one that he noted himself, which was America first is not America alone, and the United States was here to rebuild those partnerships in the region.
The IISS has in recent years increasingly recognized the interlinkages between the security of the Indo-Pacific and transatlantic theaters. European states have increased their participation in the Shangri-La Dialogue over recent years, and this year, President of France, Emmanuel Macron, gave the keynote address during the opening dinner. What were your takeaways from Macron's speech?
Again, I think a very powerful, very interesting keynote this year. Macron really spoke around his agenda for strategic autonomy. That was one that he put very much forward as a French endeavor, but also a European endeavor that entailed effectively independent capabilities and capacity, working with others by choice rather than because of dependency. Interestingly, he, in that spirit, then underscored the ties between Europe and Asia, and that this was very much a shared agenda in that sense. He proposed a positive alliance between Europe and Asia based on common norms, on common principles, whether that's a new coalition for open trade or open dialogue to de-risk, to have a stable environment, and to really stabilize what he noted was the open and rules-based order. And really central to that mission is, in his view, the need to build new partnerships. This diversification of partnerships is very much part of strategic autonomy in his view. And he also offered, in that sense, Europe almost as a third way amid great power competition in the region between the United States and China, a challenge that he faces in Europe and that Europe faces as much as countries in this region, in his view, face. He noted in that respect very much the 2018 Indo-Pacific strategy that France launched, and noted that a review and a reissue of that strategy was upcoming. So one thing to look forward to in that respect, but also underscored that a bit of a reality check moment too, that in terms of military credibility of Europe and Asia, which I think was one point that was raised also in the Q&A, he gave an honest assessment in that respect of Europe's limitations. He did mention, of course, France and military partnerships and sales. Interestingly, he noted, if the elephant in the room is the day that China decides a big operation against a country, would one intervene? And he noted, I would be very cautious today, but everyone will be very cautious today. And I think all countries in this room, wherever they live, in fact, everybody would be cautious. And so there's that questionable, I suppose, position of what can Europe militarily offer and what really is its role in that respect in possible conflict scenarios. So a very interesting message of a Europe that is, and a France that is, a strong partner in and with the region, with some sense of limitation on how much Europe really can play a military role in that respect. And I think it was fascinating as well, just as perhaps one final data point, where there was a question around whether France would offer South Korea nuclear submarines, to which he pointed towards the need to resolve the North Korea question first, but said that actually the only country that could do that was the United States and not Europe. Despite this recognition of limitations, we did have an extremely strong show of European countries at the dialogue this year. There were around 14 who all made their individual assessments of regional security, and cross-regional interlinkages really underscored the ties between the two regions and also the various roles that they could play, whether political or military, or in building capacity or working and looking at new technologies. From a European perspective at the dialogue, the message was, we're still interested, we're still engaged, and that won't change.
Continuing with the list of heads of state that attended the dialogue, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim of Malaysia delivered a special address on this Saturday. Malaysia, of course, currently holds the ASEAN chair position. How did the Prime Minister's speech compare and contrast with that of President Macron and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth?
Prime Minister Anwar gave a very interesting speech, one where, of course, he spoke not just as the Prime Minister of Malaysia, but also as the chair of ASEAN. And you saw that reflected in his prepared remarks, very much on the need for coming together, for cooperation. He spoke, of course, around recent developments, be that Timor-Leste's historical admission to ASEAN as its 11th member, to the continued need to find a way forward on Myanmar, as well as the widening of ASEAN's what he called strategic aperture. So in particular, naming the ASEAN GCC summit, as well as the launch of the China GCC ASEAN Trilateral Initiative. I think what was really interesting as well is that he did mention, the growing risk of global fragmentation, which is something that is not necessarily, in his view, a positive development for the world, or a direction in which he and others in the region hope to see it. There was one particular quote which I thought was incredibly interesting to note, which is that a stable region is not one that is braced for conflict, but one grounded in openness, transparency, and habit-forming cooperation. He noted that despite the challenges which he recognized in the region, he noted that Malaysia, for example, remains deeply concerned about the potential for escalation among claimants in the South China Sea. Malaysia and he himself were not interested in seeing or believing in spheres of influence. And that stability does not come, he said, from carving up the map, but from creating space for all to participate meaningfully in shaping the order we live in. Balancing the challenges in the region, certainly those domestic in the region and rooted in national challenges, but also the wider strategic challenge that he sees in terms of the greater geopolitical question of US and China competition, and really trying to find a way to, so he says, find a dynamic equilibrium that enables cooperation without coercion and a balance without bloc politics.
Morgan, over to you. As in last year's Shangri-La Dialogue, the dialogue featured various discussions this year about Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and the Israel-Hamas conflict. In Southeast Asia, the conflict in Myanmar continues. How did regional and extra-regional states talk about the conflict in Myanmar at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue?
Thanks, Meia. Well, there were a number of comments and assessments given about the situation in Myanmar, which 5 years since the war began continues to deteriorate, especially after the devastating earthquake of 28 March. We heard a few points in particular from Malaysia's Prime Minister Anwar, who expectedly reiterated that the 5-point consensus remains ASEAN's guiding framework for addressing the issue. This consensus calls for a cessation of violence and inclusive dialogue among relevant parties. The Prime Minister revealed that Malaysia has invited certain groups for dialogue in Kuala Lumpur, although we didn't hear any details or whether or not that process has achieved any progress. A major problem for opposition groups in Myanmar is that they lack access to a secure venue where they can meet amongst themselves. Most importantly, the Prime Minister responded to a question about regime-orchestrated elections scheduled for the end of this year or early 2026. He said that the priorities should instead be a cessation of violence, humanitarian assistance, and inclusive dialogue before elections take place, and that elections that are not inclusive or fair will not solve the problems. This is certainly one of the most clear stances taken by Malaysia on the prospect of elections so far. And interestingly, it contrasts with the position that we know is being taken by China, who is helping the regime prepare for elections at the end of the year. Thailand's defense minister also took several questions on the Myanmar issue. He revealed that Thailand was engaging certain groups, which we can assume means opposition forces in Myanmar. The defense minister also encouraged other countries to engage more with Myanmar, meaning engage with the Myanmar military government. And so the minister's willingness to make this suggestion underlines two important ongoing shifts in the regional approach to the Myanmar issue. On the one hand, ASEAN is becoming more willing to see Thailand individually make efforts to deal with the Myanmar issue, whereas in the past, such attempts were seen as undermining ASEAN's centrality or circumnavigating the five-point consensus. On the other hand, it could indicate a greater willingness to publicly engage the Myanmar military, which since the 2021 coup, ASEAN's position has been that the Myanmar military is not allowed to join high-level meetings with ASEAN until there is progress in implementing the five-point consensus. We did hear very briefly in the Q&A session from President Macron, who mentioned that his delegation had had conversations about the Myanmar issue with their Singaporean counterparts, although the president didn't elaborate any further on what France's position is or if discussions have generated any new ideas or decision points.
Maybe bridging from Myanmar to another point of discussion that comes up at the Shangri-La Dialogue. There's always the question of to what extent countries in the region, which are quite varied, are focused on great power competition or indeed other topics. Did transnational organized crime feature as a serious point of discussion at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue, or did you see really more of a discussion around the big topic of great power competition between the US and China?
Transnational crime and other security threats across the Mekong, particularly those that emanate from Myanmar, were briefly mentioned throughout the dialogue, but to be honest, there was really no substantive discussion on the topic. And I think this reflects two things. First, that the issue of transnational crime is seen by global leaders as more of a slow burn. And so at a time of geostrategic upheaval and rising great power competition, these issues are simply not being prioritized. But I think it's also fair to say that there remains a bit of a disconnect between Europe and the region. European leaders who come to Southeast Asia commonly make the connection in their speeches between the security of the region and what's happening in Ukraine. In other words, they're trying to convince leaders in Southeast Asia to care more about what's happening in Europe. But then at the same time, we see that European leaders don't give much priority to the major security concerns in the region, for example, the Myanmar issue or the transnational crime, instead framing on these greater big ticket issues, if you will, the South China Sea, US-China competition, and these issues that they see as more pressing for global security, although the fact remains that Myanmar and transnational security threats are still one of the biggest concerns in the region.
Darshana, Pacific Island states were represented at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue, as in previous years. What did they raise as key security and defense priorities for their countries, and how do these complement or contrast of those from Southeast Asia or the middle and great powers in the region?
For South Pacific, the issue of climate has always been a big national security issue and a threat, and that certainly has come up. But even in one of the previous editions of Shangri-La, defense minister from the South Pacific, who was sharing the stage with Canada and Singapore and others, who said perhaps his office deals far more with the threats arising from climate change than his counterparts do. So they did raise the issue of climate and climate related, what that does in terms of crisis management, what that does in terms of security issues, not just food security, not just human security, but generally as a national security issue, and how that actually shapes their foreign policy choices and priorities for that time going forward, and how that in return has an impact making their national security threat assessment or prioritizing areas. So it's not really just hard security versus soft security, which was another thing that I saw as a theme that emerged at the Shangri-La between actually European leaders as well as both Southeast Asian and Pacific leaders that I heard, was that the concept of security has broadened. It's broadened within the last decade to include a lot more of areas that perhaps sat at the periphery or wasn't in the list of urgencies in the last couple of years, which there's a common sense that when we talk about security in the region, regardless of the theater we are discussing, the issues that come under the bubble of security have increased. And I thought the South Pacific leaders this time did get a sense that perhaps not down to this nuance of it, but there is that more of that shared goal or shared understanding of what we mean when we say there's a security problem in the region.
You mentioned crisis management, and you, of course, chaired a simultaneous special session on crisis management in the region. Considering the recent event between India and Pakistan and rising tensions in East Asia, did you see any common approach or consensus in the conversations on your special session?
This was a really interesting conversation because it brought to the surface how diverse and how fragmented the conversation on crisis management is. And one thing that came out was when we talk about crisis management, depending on the region we're talking about and depending on the countries we're talking around, it sort of separates into disaster crisis management or conflict crisis management. And sometimes they remain separate, but sometimes they start to merge, that there could be a conflict which could lead to a disaster, or there could be a disaster that could lead to conflict. We had a panel with Canada, Pacific Island Forums, Pakistan, and Fiji on that. So you can imagine how different the points of view were and their experiences were. Unfortunately, there was no common agreement on an approach, but the common agreement was that there needs to be better and more effective crisis management mechanisms. I think there was a recognition and acknowledgement amongst all four speakers that whatever the mechanisms are within their own sub-regional or regional levels and the crisis that they face in whatever form you frame it as, whether disaster or conflict, we're not necessarily working or could sustain the tensions or fractions that they foresee emerging around their geography. I think that's a conversation that we'll have to keep pursuing and taking forward. And also, how best can we perhaps find middle ground between the disaster crisis management mechanisms and conflict crisis management mechanisms?
If you think about this year's Shangri-La Dialogue, what was your one big takeaway from this year's event in terms of state of the region, state of geopolitics in the region, and the stability of the region moving forward? Darshana, starting with you.
Thanks, Meia. There was a lot of course, interest around the Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's speech and how that was going to land in the region. He had already been in the Indo-Pacific a few times before. This is his first Shangri-La. I thought he was really clear in articulating what America wants in the region or what his, I guess, team thought about it. He mentioned a few times that we are here to stay, we are committed to the region, and we are not going anywhere. But the note that stood out for me and which would have an impact on the alliances, but also partnership, was that we are here to stay in the region and we're not going anywhere. And we are here to commit, but it's going to be on our terms. It's going to be in terms of where we see a threat, where we think our resources should be deployed, and how we can work with partners. And partners, a similar conversation to what they've said to Europe, that partners will have to carry some of that weight, but that I see less of in terms of that US would do things or invest resources or invest in directions where they don't necessarily see a strategic gain that they may have done in the past in their relationship, whether it's with Japan or Australia or South Korea. So I think that is going to be a little bit of adjustment in the region. And it might not be new for countries in Southeast Asia who are not in treaty-based alliances or who don't operate within that framework, but it would be new in terms of, I think, the treaty-based allies in the region on that. So we got a very clear answer. Is America leaving or are they going to stay? The answer is yes, they are going to stay. And he was very clear, but he was also very clear what they aim to do in that. And I'm not sure that answer was what allies and partners were looking for necessarily in the same line and sense of urgency.
Morgan?
So I think it's important to think about what topics we didn't hear much about at the Shangri-La Dialogue. To be honest, in relation to the issue of Myanmar, a lot of the points that we heard were points that have been recycled from previous years. We didn't hear a lot of new, fresh ideas about how to deal with the issue, although we did hear continued or enduring commitments to dealing with the Myanmar issue, but it doesn't really seem that stakeholders necessarily know how to find a way forward. And so I think there's a lot of fatigue in dealing with the ongoing crisis. And this should be concerning with regard to ASEAN's overall preparedness for dealing with a regional contingency or for preventing conflict in the region. The fact is that ASEAN's conflict prevention architecture remains underdeveloped, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done. In the days leading up to the Shangri-La Dialogue, there was a clash on the border between Cambodia and Thailand, and one soldier was killed. And so there are still lingering security issues within the region among ASEAN members, and that's not even beginning to think about a crisis that could involve extra-regional stakeholders. And so that should be of concern, and moving forward, hopefully we can begin to see more substantive discussions about what actual mechanisms can be used rather than these kind of broad level conceptual discussions, which of course are important but need to be developed further.
Veerle, what was your one takeaway from the dialogue if you had to choose?
I think countries will have gone into this dialogue with a certain level of uncertainty around the challenges that we're seeing in different parts of the world, the resource allocation that demands, and the strategic concentration that demands, and then what that really means for this part of the world in terms of partnerships. I think there will have been reassuring messages across the 2.5 days or so. There will have also been moments where, as Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim stressed, the focus must remain on cooperation and collaboration.
That's all we have time for today, so thank you Veerle, Morgan, and Darshana for sharing all your insights. And thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. You can find more information on the topics discussed in today's episode in our show notes. Please do follow, rate, and subscribe to Sound Strategic wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts to keep up to date with all the latest episodes. Thank you and see you next time.